Welcome to the Orton Gillingham Podcast, a Brainspring production. Today, we're joined by special guest Dr. David Kilpatrick, a certified school psychologist, professor emeritus of psychology for the State University of New York College at Cortland, an avid researcher of learning disabilities, and author of several works on literacy. His seminal book, Equipped for Reading Success, has become an essential component of literacy curricula and programs across the country, and has helped thousands of students learn to read.
Welcome to the Orton Gillingham Podcast. I'm here, Esther, and I'm here with Kara, my co-host. Today we have a very special guest joining us today, and if you're a teacher, a school psychologist, anybody who works within education, an interventionist, you very likely read a book by Dr. David Kilpatrick. My first introduction to Dr. Kilpatrick's work was back in around 2017. We did a book study on Equipped for Reading Success. All of our instructors joined in, and we really kind of delved into this book. We've known for a long time how important phonological and phonemic awareness is to reading. What I learned, though, from the book was how to actually apply this knowledge. You know, we know what it is, but how do we actually bring this to this information to us, to our students, to help them read better? And so how do I apply this knowledge to word recognition and connect it to orthographic mapping or orthographic memory? So we're here to kind of talk about those things today. And welcome, Dr. Kilpatrick. We're really honored that you came to speak with us today. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah. So this is the Orton Gillingham Podcast, and we ask almost all of our guests the same question. We kind of start off the same way. And we just say, tell us your story. So how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, I have to begin with an apology. I'm getting over a cold, so
that's okay.
that may come up from time to time.
No problem.
Well, I worked as a school psychologist for 28 years, and I've actually been teaching at the university for 30 years. If you do the math, that makes me well into my 80s, but I'm not. Those overlap by 22 years. So I was a full-time school psychologist in an elementary school between 88 and 2006. And then I went full-time at the university. But in the 11 years prior to going full-time, I was part-time, and I was teaching courses on learning disabilities, educational psychology, et cetera. So I had access to the research journals since 94, since I started teaching part-time at the university. One of the things that really struck me, working with our resource teacher, our reading teacher, and our special ed teacher, they noticed that, let me back up a little bit. In 88, we were a whole word school, all right? Not whole language, but whole word, the classic Dick and Jane, C-spot run, up, 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 that kind of thing. We transitioned to whole language in the early to mid 90s. But we were a whole word school, and kids did not get any phonics instruction unless they showed reading problems. Then the reading teacher might have provided some of that. Our reading teacher was mostly a reading diagnostician, so we didn't have too much what we would now call tier 2 instruction going on, unfortunately. And then they'd end up in the resource room, and she provided phonics instruction, and our special ed teachers did. So these kids would suddenly be making all these gains once they got exposed to phonics. But one of the patterns that the teachers were telling me, the intervention teachers were telling me, is they weren't remembering words. So they'd sound out a word, and they'd see it in the next paragraph, and they wouldn't know it. So that dawned on me. I'm thinking, how do we remember words? You know, and I started asking around. I didn't know. I was trained in psychology and cognitive psychology. And as it turns out, I didn't know at the time that cognitive psychology has contributed a huge amount to this whole effort. I just didn't know that at the time. So I had access to the research literature, and my first intuition was that we were remembering words based on some sort of visual memory.
Right.
But by that point, lots of accumulated research show that just can't be the case. I mean, think about it. We recognize words, uppercase, lowercase, different fonts, handwriting. It's not about a visual memory. It's something different. Well, by dumb luck, I went to a seminar by a guy named Phil McGinnis in the summer of 1997. He sort of ended up becoming my mentor. He passed away in 2002. I refer to him as my mentor. If he were around today, he might not want to think that. I don't know. But anyway, he alerted me to the fact that there was this huge body of research on reading that existed outside of my field of school psychology, and I didn't even know about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I had access to the literature, and I just tore into it. I mean, that first year, reading a research report, research articles, not like committing yourself to a book.
Right.
Sometimes you can knock off an article just during a working lunch at your desk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So within that first year, I read over 100 research reports at least, and it really transformed my thinking dramatically. Well, based on dumb luck, one of the things that I came across was Linnea Airey's theory of how we remember words. It's only been since 2014 that she started referring to her theory as orthographic mapping. Prior to that, she would, in all of her research and her writing, she would just start in with how kids learn to read or remember words, et cetera. So when we talk about her research across the decades, orthographic mapping is a little bit anachronistic. It's just the term she used more recently, for almost 10 years now. So anyway, once I understood, when I first read about her theory, it intrigued me, but I didn't understand it. I thought I understood it, but I didn't understand it. It's it's a little tough to get. But then I had my aha moment. And once you have your aha moment and you understand it, and you're like, oh yeah, all kinds of things start falling into place. Things start making all kinds of sense. And the research literature starts making all kinds of sense. So that's really what got me going on this. And so we started implementing this. Now, this is not a research study I'm about to describe. It's strictly an anecdote. But I convinced our reading teachers, by that point, throughout the 90s, we were doing reading recovery. And reading recovery was the program kids went through before they went into resource, because it just wasn't helping. And so we had to have a grant, because that one-on-one is very expensive. So when we lost that grant, by the late 90s, early 2000s, a little bit of a vacuum in terms of who was responsible for reading at the district level, blah, blah, blah. So we had some freedom to do what we thought was a good idea in our building. And our reading teachers were starting to read articles I was providing them, and they bought into it. And we reduced, starting the first year and for a 5-year period, we reduced the number of kids that we were sending off to resource with reading difficulties by 75%.
Wow.
Now, if that sounds amazing and hard to believe, we didn't do as good as the articles that we were mimicking. We were doing nothing creative, clever. They were doing monkey see, monkey do with the research articles that I presented to them. And those articles were getting closer to 80 to 85% reduction in reading problems. So as amazing as our results were, in theory, they could have been better.
So what kinds of things were the teachers...
kind of what got me going on this, yeah.
I'm just curious about what kinds of things the teachers were doing to get those results. I mean, you gave them articles to read. What were they actually doing with the students to...
Well, first of all, they were doing phonics, but secondly, they field tested and implemented the Equip book. That's the part of the history behind that.
Great. Okay.
That has a long history. That started life in 1973 or 4 with Rosner's auditory motor program.
Yes. Okay.
And McGinnis was a president and then vice president and secretary, that's how these things go, of the New York Association of School Psychologists. And he brought Rosner in the 70s to present to school psychologists. And school psychologists are like, what does this auditory training have to do with visual word recognition? And it just didn't resonate with people.
Right.
And so McGinnis kind of updated it. Rosner's manual became public domain 10 years after it was published. It's right on the copyright page. And so McGinnis did a lot of revamping of that and updating it. And he also was in a situation where he had worked in a school, but also had access to the literature because he taught some graduate courses at Nazareth College near Rochester, New York.
Okay.
So anyway, that's what they were doing. They were basically fixing the phonemic awareness problems these kids had, as well as presenting them with the phonics. Okay. And they were having great results, and they were giddy about it.
Yeah. That's great. That's super exciting. So, then at that point you started, writing books. So you were a educational psychologist. You did all this research and you presented it. And at what point did you step away from being a educational psychologist and move into just this field of writing and sharing all this knowledge with people?
That's a little complicated question, actually. But um, so, as I said, starting in '94, I started teaching part-time here at State University of New York at Cortland. And it was afternoon. I did my day job and then went down and did like later classes or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2006, those flip-flopped. So I became full-time at Cortland, and then the salary drop was so huge.
Oh.
I'd been 18 years in the school district, beginning assistant professor. And I said, they offered it to me. I said, I can't do it because of the cost. Well, we worked out a deal and we went up through the channels, the dean and the provost. I was like, what's a provost, right? Anyway, they're like a vice president of the college. But we went up through the channels and said, would they allow me to continue to work part-time in the school to supplement the huge, we had 5 kids, we had a house payment, et cetera.
Sure, yeah.
So they said, you've been teaching these courses for years, so it's not like you're a beginning person. And the kind of courses you teach, it would actually be to your advantage that you maintain a presence in the school. So they're like, you work it out with your department chair about scheduling classes, and yeah. So I got this informal approval, and that lasted for about 10 years. And then back in 2016, I've been just at the university. So that's kind of the complicated history with that.
Yeah.
And the writing is kind of interesting. I never set out to write a book in either case. What happened was McGinnis and I, just a matter of a couple months before he passed away, he has an amazing program that did not survive him, unfortunately. It was called Assured Readiness for Learning, and it dealt with reading, writing, and math. And I got to travel with him around the Northeast the last few years of his life when he did summer presentations. And, an administrator would say, oh, you're with the program? Oh my gosh, look at where our kids were. Look where they are now in all those areas. So his was much broader than this. And he recognized how important the phonemic awareness was. And he said, people aren't going to be getting this except if they come to one of these summer programs he did. He said, so I'm thinking about writing a phonemic awareness book. And well, unbeknownst to him, but I told him at that point, I did not want to, when I did an evaluation, and one of the things I recommended to the parents is to help develop the phonemic awareness, I didn't have anything to give them. And I respected him too much to just like copyright the sections of his book and hand them to parents. And I didn't have the guts to ask him. I felt like it would be kind of imposing.
Yeah.
One of the things he did is he only gave you a certain number of the different training aspects at each level and expected teachers to come up with all the rest on their own. That was just how we did it. And I was like, I work in a school. I don't think teachers want to do that. So I basically went and developed all of these based on his recommendation. And when he brought this up to me, I said, well, guess what? Almost all those activities are already done. Right?
Perfect. Yes.
And anyway, the whole, in the preface, this is all described or whatever.
Yeah.
So really, this was supposed to be a co-authored book where I was a tag along, but he passed away. So again, this wasn't something I had planned.
Right.
Then in 2014, I was asked to write a book chapter in a series for school psychologists called Essentials In, and they have all kinds of, a whole bunch in that series. And I was asked by the authors of a book where each chapter was written by a different author. And I shared something at a New York Association of School Psychologists conference with Dawn Flanagan down at St. John's University. And, you share something with people and that's the end of it usually, right? Out of the blue, she contacts me and says, hey, that was really cool. It was about orthographic mapping. And she said, that's really cool. She said, would you like to contribute a chapter to this book? Well, I did. And the 3 editors of that book liked that concept. And they said, how about turning it into a whole book? I'm like, okay. And so they proposed this to the editors of the series, and the editors accepted it, and that's the origin behind that. So in no case I was like, I want to write a book.
Right. Yeah. No, that's great. And your life has clearly changed because of it. I mean, you
and changed everybody else's lives. Right?
Yes. And I often say this, we teach courses at Brain Spring, and your book is always brought up as a reference when we begin talking about phonological and phonemic awareness, and it's brought up as a reference that they should get. And I say, I've taught English and taught kids to read for years and years and years, but I picked up when I read this book, Equipped for Reading Success, I learned something I had never even thought of before. I mean, and it really changed the way I understand what goes on in the brain when we read. And I think that is the most valuable thing that people are walking away with.
That aha moment.
That's that
he
exactly.
explained.
Exactly. So
so this is a good segue.
Yeah.
For our listeners, could you define briefly what phonemic awareness and phonological awareness is? And then we'd like to approach questions from from 3 different perspectives: from the research perspective, the educator perspective, and then a parent perspective. So if you could just,
Sure.
if you could explain.
So phonemes are defined as the smallest unit within our speech stream that allow us to tell one word or syllable apart from another. They're not the smallest units of speech. Those are called phones. Not to get confusing, this won't be on the test. All right. But for example, a diphthong may be made up of 2 phones, right? Like oi, but we treat it as a single phoneme because that unit is what tells that word apart from another word. So it's more of a psychological, perceptual unit of our language that keys into language. It's not just about sounds. So it's the smallest unit within our spoken language that helps us distinguish between words. And so phonological is used more broadly to refer to anything related to speech. We typically distinguish this from auditory. So auditory gets used to refer, 2 different ways. One of the problems that we have in the research and communicating this research is researchers use the same term in different ways. And so that becomes a problem. Even though every researcher learned in Psych 101 that you have to have a clear, crisp operational definition. And they do, but they do different operational definitions from one study to the next. Anyway, one way auditory gets used is to refer to everything we take in through our ears. And therefore phonological, which is the sounds related to spoken language, is a subcategory. Other people use auditory to refer to non-phonological input in our ears, like environmental sounds or whatever. Regardless, so it's the sounds related to speech that phonological deals with. And as it turns out, we have a alphabetic writing. That term is not very informative. It comes from the first 2 letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. That's where we get alphabet from. But alphabetic writing is intended to capture the phonemes in the speech stream. And that's why phonemic awareness is so important, because our language, our written language, is based on noticing the phonemes. If you don't ever develop an alphabetic writing, you probably don't develop phonemic awareness, and you don't need to. Until in China, until they started teaching pinyin, which is like they take the Chinese words, spoken words, and put them in Roman or Latin characters, like English, German, French, or Latin characters, or Roman characters. And then they put those under the Chinese characters, but then by about 3rd grade, they take those away, and now they just rely on the Chinese characters. Well, guess what? In China, they're also taught that, and many kids are taught English as well. But prior to that, studies that go back several decades, when they weren't doing that yet, and they would find Chinese adults who were perfectly good readers of Chinese. They couldn't do phonemic awareness that our 1st graders could do.
Interesting.
And other studies back then, they looked at illiterate farmers in Portugal who never were taught to read. It's not that they had a reading problem; they just were never taught to read. They could not identify phonemes in Portuguese words like our 1st graders can. So here, and this becomes a problem that hopefully we'll bring up a little bit later. For typically developing readers, the phonemic awareness they're going to need for remembering words via orthographic mapping is going to develop pretty normally as just a part of being taught an alphabetic writing system. And then there's this reciprocal interaction between the two until the point that their phoneme skills are so automatic, memory for words becomes automatic as well. This gets lost on a lot of people. So a lot of people are like, well, you can learn to read, develop phonemic awareness just by being exposed to the alphabet. It's like, right. Not the kids I work with in my career.
Yeah.
Kids with the phonological core deficit behind poor word level reading. Those kids do not develop the phonemic awareness they need simply by being exposed to alphabetic letters and the sounds associated with those letters. So you asked me for the time and I told you how to build a watch. So we should probably go on to the next question.
Thank you. Okay, so since you have written Equipped for Reading Success in 2016, has anything changed from from your understanding of phonological awareness over that time frame?
My answer is probably going to surprise people. Okay. I think a lot of folks, educators, they're just kind of learning about all this reading research that they may not have gotten in their grad programs or undergrad programs, and they're hearing it in bits and pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's almost this sense like new stuff's coming out all the time that's advancing our knowledge. Well, science is more like a glacier, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're not seeing huge changes and breakthroughs, but people might be getting their individual breakthroughs there as they're learning something new. So I hate to disappoint people, but things are not moving at some huge rapid pace.
Right.
Here's the second part. I could have written those materials and they would be considered very, very current and never cited anything after the year 2000.
Huh.
So much of what we know, so much of that base of knowledge was established in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but people didn't start knowing about it or thinking about it till later. Now, don't get me wrong. Our knowledge has been refined. We've been able to fine tune things. We've been able to add another study to the pile that already shows what we already know, et cetera. I think the biggest problem, and I'll come back to this when you talked about coming from different perspectives, the biggest problem is to get researchers and teachers to understand the specific role of phonemic skills in remembering words.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a common assumption among a fairly large degree of researchers, but I'll come back to that.
Mm.
So I hate to tell you, but there aren't any huge things. I have noticed some things that are really cool that weren't in the manual that I use when I present to people and talk to people. But many of those things, didn't just come up recently. This store of reading research is just absolutely vast. People don't realize how much there is to sift through. So not a whole lot has changed.
Okay.
Really.
Well, what's that?
that?
Do you have what is one thing that didn't come up in the manual?
Yeah, I think a really significant entry point, and this pops up in a lot of the articles from the 80s and 90s, is to start kids off with two phoneme words. And you think about this in terms of both letter sound knowledge that you have to keep track of, but in terms of phonemes. Notice the difference between e,
Mm-hmm.
and, right? As opposed to way more to keep track of,
Mm-hmm.
right? So kind of entering in to be able to get kids to notice phonemes. It's easier for kids to notice the phonemes in a 2-phoneme word than it is to notice phonemes in a 3-phoneme word. That's not news.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's
Right.
pretty old.
Right.
And I do have a few examples of that, but I didn't draw it out as much as I wish I had.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
I mean, we've been hearing so much lately now about blending and segmenting, right? And that the blending and segmenting are the essential parts of phonological awareness skills that we should explicitly teach. And then we look at other skills on that continuum, like rhyming and onset and rhyme, those kinds of things that fall under more the phonological piece. So that I think people are saying, maybe we don't explicitly need to really teach rhyming. Maybe we should just go straight to spending our time on blending and segmenting, because that's definitely where we're seeing the success with kids and the correlation to their reading improvement. So, I mean, how do you respond to that as far as all of the things on the phonological awareness continuum? I mean, should we just be focusing on blending and segmenting?
Yep, that's also a complicated question. We've known for a long time that rhyming is kind of strange in terms of its relationship with some of those other tasks that we do. We've literally known this since the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So here's kind of a little bit of the background of rhyming. You take information about rhyming in preschoolers and early kindergartners, that's going to predict kids that are good at rhyming at that point is going to predict, success in reading by the end of 1st or 2nd grade.
Mm-hmm.
You take data on rhyming at the end of kindergarten, beginning of first grade, it correlates with almost nothing. Okay. So, and I think there's a reason for that, and I'll come back to it a little more depth, but the reason is that it's giving us a little insight into the integrity of the phonological system early on with those kids. But there comes a point where most kids can rhyme. So how are you going to get that to correlate with weak readers and strong readers? So even many weak readers can rhyme just fine. Then there's another weird part of this, and this is why it doesn't fit so well with some of the others, is you can have kids that go on to be good readers and still struggle with rhyming.
Sure.
So rhyming has never been anything I particularly recommended. I know a lot of people keep wanting to supplement the equipped book and say, well, we want to do rhyming. I'm like,
Yeah.
if you want to do that with kindergartners, go ahead. You're not going to harm anything, but you don't need to. It's just not necessary. So there's nothing wrong with doing it, especially in preschool and early kindergarten. There really isn't. Because what it's doing is it's trying to get your ear attuned to the sounds we make when we speak. When kids hear chair, bus, mom, etc., they think of what they're referring to semantically. They don't think about the sounds we make when we speak. So rhyming, especially in early reading to kids and everything, rhyming gets them to start thinking about the sounds we make when we speak. So it's almost like a little bit of an entryway into that. And by the way, rhyming does isolate a phoneme, because if you're going hat, sat, fat, bat, you're isolating that first phoneme, right? So there is depending on how you want to look at it, right? A chef says a tomato is a vegetable, and a botanist says it's a fruit, right? They're both correct. So you could say that rhyming, one way of looking at it, is a phoneme level activity, but it's not a very useful one in terms of assessment or whatever beyond the early stages.
Okay.
Now, when you get to the issue of these other tasks, one of the things I'm trying to get people away from is a task mentality, and get them on a skill mentality. There's a difference. There are only two skills that we need, two phonemic skills we need to be good at reading, okay? And one is a synthesis skill, meaning putting sounds together, and the other is an analysis skill, which is pulling sounds apart. We need both of them, and in skilled readers, they're both highly proficient and automatic. They don't have to sit and think about it or whatever. I'll come back to that because that's pretty central. So here's what's happened. You have, in the 1960s, they start realizing that phonological tasks correlate with reading. So they came up with a whole bunch of phonological tasks. When it comes to synthesis, one task has dominated all the other tasks, and that is an oral blending task. What word am I saying? At, hat. And that's very close. That's a task. That very closely parallels the cognitive skill, the linguistic skill, that we don't see. Tasks we see because we interact with kids and we see how they respond, but we can't see what's going on between their ears. So there's a pretty close connection. However, when it comes to analysis, because I'm a boring guy, I sat down at my dining table one night and I came up with over 20 different analysis tasks that have been used in the research literature. We mostly use one for synthesis. I mean, occasionally like addition, say cat, but put in front of it. That's a synthesis task. People want to categorize that as manipulation. It's like, well, yeah, but it's a synthesis task, like blending. So what are all those telling you? What are all those different skills telling you? So let me tell you, after that Essentials book came out, the folks behind the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test contacted me and said, would you like to help us revise the Wyatt 3 into the Wyatt 4 with all the reading subtests? And I said, yeah, under two conditions. Number one, I do not get paid at all. I don't want to have any financial involvement. I'd love to be able to recommend it when it's done and not have people think I'm benefiting, because I'm not. I said, and second, and they were like, cool. Anyway, so secondly, I said, you got to get my name in there somewhere. And they did. Okay. So they gave it a first shot, and they mimicked all the other tests that are out there. And they said, what do you think? This is what we have planned. And they had because they didn't have a phonemic awareness test yet on that battery. They were the last of the major ones to do that. And they had some blending items, and they had some segmentation items, and some deletion items, and some rhyming items, whatever. And they're going to bundle it together. And I said to them, what is that telling you? And they're like, I don't know. That's kind of why we're asking you, right? So I said to them, let's come at it from a skill mentality. There are only two skills. The two skills are being able to blend something together and be able to analyze, pull it apart, but it has to be automatic. So we developed the phonemic proficiency subtest, which is based largely on the PASS, the phonological awareness screening test, which is free online. You go to thepasstest.com. And there you're looking at speed of reaction time, and the results were unbelievable. I mean, you have a nationally normed group of kids, and when it comes to this subtest, age 6 to adulthood, nationally normed, nationally stratified. Studies just aren't that crisp and clear. You got one little group in this one little area at this little age level. And what was found was that the speed of reaction to the phonemic task, did they respond quickly and instantly, ranged from 1 dip down to 0.5. Most of them were 0.6 and higher. I don't know if that means anything to people, but that's pretty strong throughout the entire age range. You're lucky if you get to 0.5 with first graders with a segmentation task, and then it drops off dramatically by second grade and whatever, okay? So when we looked at the speed of response to those items, it had amazing correlations throughout first grade through adults, and all the word reading subtests. Then we looked at correct responses that weren't responded to instantly in under 2 seconds. The correlation hovered around 0. So that is categorized. Both of those come under the same heading of phonemic awareness. But in the first case, the kids were aware of the phonemes. They got the item right, but they weren't automatic. They weren't proficient. So simply being aware of phonemes, it correlates 0 across a nationally stratified sample. I didn't gather that data. That was gathered by Pearson Incorporated, right? And so this is pretty significant. And they didn't do that because I told them. I sent them some articles to show this, right? So it wasn't just some crazy idea of mine. Anyway, so when we talk about the skill is for phonemic awareness. Think about this. We know, those of us here assembled, we know tens of thousands of words, written words, stored away in our long-term memory. Of those tens of thousands of words, what percentage of them did you put conscious effort into remembering when you first came across it? Did you run and get flashcards 30,000 times? Did you go through 30,000 sessions where you had to go through 18 times? No.
Yeah.
We learn words automatically in the background. Right. Notice how different that was when we had to memorize our math facts and memorize our state capitals and our chemistry terms and our biology terms. Very different. Orthographic learning is amazing. Now, that is a reality we have to account for. The reality is we are storing words automatically and in the background. That means that any skills required for that to happen have to be automatic.
Yes.
Right? That logically follows. I mean, you never met someone to say, oh, I'm automatic with walking, but every step takes conscious effort.
Right.
Makes no sense, right?
Right.
Now, Airy says that in order for us to remember words, what we're doing is we have to have access to the phoneme in the spoken word, and we have to map that onto the actual letter or those phonemes in the order of the spoken word onto the phonemes in the order of the written word.
Right.
That has happened post-identification. I can't do that mapping unless I know what the word is in front of me because I don't know what to map it to. So we use phonics to determine a word we don't know, but once we know the word, that's a requirement for mapping it.
Yes.
So if you put those together in terms of a simple logical argument, you have to have automatic access to phonemes in order to be good at remembering words.
Yes.
That's what's called the deductive argument. That's like stronger than an RCT, by the way, if you want to look that up and take a philosophy of logic course. So basically, that's a skill. That's the skill we're going at. All right, now let's look at all those tasks. Those different 20 or more tasks, and I'm not even including some of the tasks did first sound, others did last sound or whatever. That's still under one of the 20 tasks, right? Those 20 tasks are all doing a better or lesser job at estimating that underlying skill we have for reading. So what we have to get away from a task mentality and say, oh, should we train deletion? Should we train blending? Should we train substitution? Should we train all these identification, categorization? No. That's so 90s. It's kind of like my shirt drawer, It's very 90s. Okay? So the idea is we're missing the point. The point is that we have an underlying skill we can't see that's allowing us to read. It has to do with phonemes. And all those different, it's just kind of coincidental that with the synthesis, we have one dominant task, blending.
Mm-hmm.
But with analysis, we have a whole bunch of them. And how do we know which ones are getting closer to that underlying skill? Correlations. So the correlation, so as it turns out, segmentation, as I told you, drops off after first grade and second grade dramatically. Phoneme deletion and substitution, when you have specifically when you have a timing element, even if you don't, it's maintained over time. So what that's telling us is that those are giving us a better estimate of the underlying skill we need for reading.
Yeah.
And when I get over and over people that say, oh, you just, like you said, just need blending and segmentation. I'm like, yeah, if you're a typical reader and you're going to be a good reader anyway, you can stop there.
Yeah.
But we know kids, I'm sure you know kids who've been through Orton Gillingham, they can segment, they can blend, and they still aren't good at remembering words. They don't. And if you give them the pass, you download the pass, you will see they will not be doing all those things automatically. So I know, once again, a longer answer than you probably expected.
That was a good one.
The other thing is researchers have noticed this. I've compiled a list of quotes from the 80s up until recently where they say the superiority of phoneme deletion and substitution over the segmentation tasks. So what Ari, in all of her writing, she talks about segmentation, but she's talking about the mental skill. She's not talking about what we do with kids. So the irony is that segmentation tasks correlate more weakly with the segmentation skill that we need to do automatically than we find in some other tasks that are more complex.
This is very interesting. I think it's I love how you broke that down. That was very good because I think it's just skimming the surface. We read articles now about this stuff, and it's just everything's changing, and we need to rethink this. But it's really just skimming the surface of really what's going on. So
I think you're putting it in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
The importance of each piece.
Yes, very good. Thank you. That was great. And I love the whole automaticity piece. I mean, that's the name of the game. I mean, really. I do have a question that's a little bit kind of a little different, but not so much. And this came from an educational psychologist who works with kids and does testing. And she was wondering what your thoughts are on kids with dyslexia and comorbid ADHD. And are you aware of any research or anything that has a high correlation between ADHD and like orthographic processing issues?
Yeah, I would recommend, now they don't get into the orthographic mapping much at all, but I would recommend a book that I use for my psychology of learning disabilities course. I use 2 books. There are no good textbooks in this area. They're so far behind. So I had to leave the textbook market in order to get some real books that professionals like ourselves would read. And the students, they get through it. They're mostly seniors and juniors. Anyway, it's by Jack Fletcher and colleagues. The second edition is 2019, and it is called Learning Disabilities, I believe. And he goes into great detail on that. They go into great detail on those kind of questions. And so I would recommend that to any of your listeners.
Great.
Again, my only concern is they don't get into the orthographic mapping stuff, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So normally when it comes to things like ADHD doesn't prevent you from becoming a good reader, because there are plenty of kids with ADHD that read just fine.
Right.
Okay. But it's a risk factor. So ADHD can make things harder to learn across the board. And in answer to the question, there is a huge amount of research studies that look at comorbid ADHD and reading difficulties. But the reality is there's not some separate magic pill you take with that case as opposed to others.
Right. Okay.
Either way, whether you are comorbid ADHD or not, you still have to develop the exact same underlying skills for reading.
So this might be a good segue from an educator perspective. What are some basic warning signs that a student may require support in phonological awareness?
Yeah, I mentioned Jack Fletcher, and I was using some of his stuff when I was doing my dissertation in the late 80s, early 90s, right? And some of the stuff he did in others back even in the 70s and the 80s, and all the research since then has shown that kids show up at kindergarten. How many uppercase letters can they identify? How many lowercase letters can they identify? How many sounds do they know? that is one of the best predictors. And since then, they've added phonological awareness. When you do basic phonological awareness, we have an accumulation of research saying the kids' phonological awareness in kindergarten predicts what they're going to do, later on. Again, it's not a one-to-one correspondence. You might get a kid who shows up with maybe the parents didn't do anything with the child, but they have the underlying phonological skills that they pick up on things in kindergarten, they catch up just fine. You may have other kids that come in and the parents did all the right things and they have 26 upper, 24 lower, and 14 sounds, right? And they have dyslexia, right? But the parents did all the great things to allow them to do that. So it's not a simple one-to-one correspondence. It's group data, right? So basic phonological awareness, basic letter sound knowledge is one of your biggest giveaways, and we've known that for a long, long time. And spelling, of course, because spelling is kind of reverse engineering the reading, right? So if kids have a hard time, you spell a simple word and you see that the letter they produce for that is way off, or there's letters missing because sounds are missing. That's also very important.
Okay. Well, how can a teacher assess, monitor, track, or an educator, not necessarily just a teacher, monitor and track these students' progress in phonological awareness over time? Is that, you kind of...
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. And I would say at minimum, fall, winter, spring, and possibly even more depending on certain kids. But as I mentioned earlier, if you go to thepasstest.com, it's free.
Okay.
It's kind of a third generation of the Rosner and Simon 1971 auditory analysis test. And if you're familiar with the CTOP, the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, their elision subtest is basically the Rosner and Simon with different words. McGinnis added some substitution items along with the deletion, and I added the timing element, which turned out, based on that norming data, to be a pretty big factor. So that's free, and there are 4 versions of it. So you're able to give the same test at multiple times without giving the same items. And if you get out to that 4th one and you start around with the first one, they're probably much farther through it anyway, that they never got to those, because there's like a ceiling effect. You don't give the whole kid the whole thing.
Right.
There's directions there to explain that. And so by the time you cycle around to the first one again, after doing it 4 times, they're on to items that they've never been exposed to anyway. So that's a free thing. It's just important to read the instructions carefully and follow the ideas. Otherwise, what is it telling you? It's not going to be valid. So
yeah, and that, just so everyone knows, there's a copy of that in the Equipped for Reading Success book, as well as a chapter kind of explaining how to interpret the results of that. So it is there and it's online.
But on the website, there was an update to the instructions because a particular U.S. state, Canadian province, I want to be as vague as possible, is field testing to use it.
Okay.
I mean, it's a free test. Why not use it?
Right.
They're looking at their own norming of it, et cetera. And so that gave me an idea of saying, okay, this was written in 2016. Let's look it over. And so I've clarified some things and whatever. So definitely use the one on the website.
Online. Okay, good to know.
That's
Thank
a good
you.
resource.
Yes.
Yeah. So one thing that I want to know is, what do people want to know right now? Do is it more of the research, or...
Yeah, I think it's putting it into practice. I will say, and I could easily go on and on about this, and I'll try to keep it to about 90 seconds. But I'm not on social media at all. I don't have Facebook. I don't have a website. The closest thing to a website is thepasstest.com, and it's about the most boring site on the internet. I think it got an award for being the most boring site. But anyway.
You're not on TikTok either. No TikTok?
Are they going to get rid of my TikTok? With me dancing and everything? Right. No, I'm not on TikTok.
Okay.
That was actually one of our questions. Where could we find you on social media? So we can't find you anywhere?
You can't.
Nowhere.
No.
Okay.
People find me by going to the university's website and typing my name in.
Okay.
And it comes through the email.
Perfect.
But people send me stuff. People let me know what's going out there. And one of the things that's become very clear is this viewpoint that's out there, that the reading panel said that letters should be visible to kids when you're doing phonemic awareness, and that the reading panel downplayed oral phonemic awareness. And that even if you do oral phonemic awareness, once you introduce letters, you don't do the oral anymore. The reading panel said none of those. That is so many steps removed from what the reading panel said. The problem is the reading panel was very ambiguous when they divided up study. Well, let me back up. The reading panel's finding on phonemic awareness was singular. They looked at a bunch of experimental studies and their finding was singular. They had one finding based on experimental data. And that was doing phonemic awareness results in superior reading and spelling than not doing phonemic awareness. The end of the story. But they had all these studies in front of them and they thought, well, let's poke around and see if we can see other things that might help with applying this. They began the section talking about this with this disclaimer saying, this is tentative, it's suggestive, it's not the final word. There could be other things that cause this. Buyer beware, basically, okay? You don't get that. I've never heard that that's ever been out on social media. And if anybody is saying the reading panel says thus and such, like the kind of things I just said, without that disclaimer, that's telling you how many steps removed they are from what the reading panel said. The reading panel's free, it's long. I think people read the summary. Now, the unfortunate part, two unfortunate things. Number one is the reading panel did not include that caveat in their executive summary. They went on with those non-experimental findings as if they were all part of it. Well, to me, it seems like, especially when people in academia have been commenting on this, you got to read the whole report. You can't just read the executive summary. Come on, do your homework. So that's the first thing is there's the whole thing about teaching phonemic awareness with letters is non-experimental. The interesting thing is the studies they categorize as teaching phonemic awareness with letters versus without letters, the without letters studies had 41% more instructional time. So guess what? That may have been the explanation for any differences between the two. We just don't know. There was an experiment. There were actually 2 experimental studies in there that directly compared having letters in front of kids versus not having letters. 2 experimental ones. They didn't call this out because I've been through those, all 52 of their reports multiple times. And 2 of them. And you know what they said? Didn't make a difference.
Really?
Right? Why didn't they say that? Because that's not what they meant by with letters. They use the word with the way the dictionary defines it, dictionary definition in my New College Dictionary #1, which is to like inclusive or accompany. I'm going to play basketball with my friend Bob. Okay. Now, people interpret it in the instrumental with, which in that dictionary is definition number 11. And, some others it's dictionary 4, which is instrumental. Like, I'm going to play basketball with my new ball. So they think with letters means letters in front of kids. They never said that, okay? When you look at all the, and then they describe 4 with letters studies. They describe them. And they talk about how they did oral activities with them. And even after they did oral activities, they introduced letters at a much later point, and they continue to do oral activities. So clearly, they didn't mean the letters should be in front of kids. Then when you look at all the studies that they reviewed in the with letters category, it's absolutely clear there's no way they could have possibly meant the letters should be in front of kids because 80% of them did not do that. And most of them introduced letters at some point, and it varied dramatically from study to study. So it's internet misinformation. And here's the problem. They're catering to kids. That advice that's faulty is catering to kids who are going to learn to read no matter what. It's not going to help the kids who are not going to learn to read because when you have letters in front of the children, that is no different on any level than letter sound knowledge. Now, I know you can get into the questioning and act like no, but you're still doing letter sound knowledge.
Right.
What's the sound you hear at the end of hat? You look and you see a T and you go, cool, right? So any kind of phoneme type thing is absolutely the same as letter sound knowledge. So they completely, in a sense, disregarded 40 years of research on phonemic awareness and reading and totally are undermining what the reading panel was trying to get across. So the reading panel was trying to get across, even though it was non-experimental studies, that look, don't teach phonemic awareness as some isolated activity and never tie it in with reading.
Right.
Isn't that common sense? Isn't that common sense?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you can give us that, we've listened to a lot of the podcasts that you've been on and we've listened to a lot of the questions, but we really kind of want to dig deep and make sure that we are conveying, the most recent news. I know, like you said, a lot of people are asking those questions. What's new? What's new? And I know you said most of it is, years old and people are starting to learn it. But what is kind of a takeaway that educators and parents could have from everything that you've, from the book that you've written? What should we know? Esther's an educator. I'm just a parent. But this is all very fascinating to me, and I've learned it with my kids growing up. That's when I had to figure out what an important piece this is. It wasn't until then I never knew anything about it. So what's a good takeaway that you could give everybody listening?
I think the idea is that we have to distinguish between two different levels of word reading that I hinted at earlier. One is to be able to identify an unfamiliar word. And we have plenty of studies and experience to show the most efficient way to do that is by sounding out the whole word. And sometimes we get a close phonetic approximate. They have a name for that now. Set for variability is what they call it. You sound out a word, it's not quite right, and you go, oh, child reads market. Oh, market, right? All right. So that is far and away, as opposed to guessing based on the first letter, length of the word, context. Those are very unreliable. But then once we know the word, what happens? And that's the second level of word reading. And that's the part that's been missing for most people. And as it turns out, automaticity is required at the letter sound level and at the phoneme level, at both of those levels. That's why, like I've given the test of word reading efficiency. It's a 45-second test. One are real words, the other are nonsense words. And when I give that to first graders, second graders, third graders, fourth graders, the first bunch of words that are nonsense words, they say them so fast as if they're words they know. That means their letter sound proficiency, that has nothing to do with phonemic awareness other than the blending. Their blending is automatic. Their access to the letter sound is automatic. And so that's what eventually develops. And that's what distinguishes kids with dyslexia, struggling word readers, is they're not automatic in the underlying skills. And so that's why I keep saying we need to think about a skill. We need to come from a skill mentality rather than a task mentality. And look at all these tasks we can throw at kids and say, what are they trying to tell us? What phoneme skills do we need to learn to read? So distinguishing the two, sounding out a new word you don't know, and then remembering it for the future, we have to understand what's going on with those two. And with the latter one, actually with the first one, you don't need automaticity. You don't. A child can sound out a word and they don't have automaticity with letter sound yet, and they don't have automaticity with blending and still get it. But before they can get to the point of being good at remembering words automatically, there has to be a change of automaticity to the phoneme access. That is the analysis part, and letter sound. Those have to be automatic.
What would be a fun activity or game that a parent could play with their kids?
Any kind of wordplay, getting kids to focus on individual phonemes, when they're younger, reading rhyming books. I know during the whole language era, Dr. Seuss got a bad name, but let's bring Dr. Seuss back out again, to read to the toddlers.
Definitely. That's great.
My parents read it to me. Those books came out, in the late 50s, early 60s. I came out in 1960. Anyway, so
those are that when Dr. When Dr. Seuss started getting a bad name, I was devastated.
No good reason. No good reason. It was based on a philosophy that you don't break words down at all.
And
that's turned out not to be accurate. So any kind of word games, any kind of getting kids to notice first sounds, then maybe eventually last sounds or whatever. And I got to believe, not that I've spent a lot of time trying, but I got to believe there's tons of stuff out on the internet that parents could find that would give them things and activities they could do with kids. It seems like now, just in the last several years, everybody and their uncle will now have a website on reading.
Right.
Well, if you have a parent who has any reservations about, like, what if their child isn't rhyming, or what if they're reading these books and they seem to be struggling a little bit, what suggestions do you have for them?
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky. I mean, I could obviously recommend the Equip book or whatever, because the original version was intended for parents, by the way, only secondarily to be, the original 2002 version. And I do want to make one little comment here. Starting about 5 or 6 years ago, I have not made a cent off that book. Okay. I went 3 years in a row. I went to the mountains of Haiti and I came back and I said, you know what? We got a house, we got a car. I don't need this money. So I just get whatever money I get is from my university work here, and that's it. And so that when I do presentations, I haven't seen a penny of those presentations for years. It's all been going into a fund, and we have a major project that we're using that fund for. It's almost done, and I won't get into any details now, but so kind of like the Wyatt 4 thing. I don't have a financial investment in this, and so is that okay for me to recommend it then? Given that I'm not-
Absolutely.
Yeah, we
whatever.
we do sell your book at BrainSpring. We sell this book.
Oh,
We
there you
recommend.
go.
We do. We sell it
Buy it
because
from them, and then they'll get a piece of it. Good, perfect.
but
I'll do a commercial for you.
whoever buys this book is I mean,
But really, the
it's-
original version, you'll see this in the preface, the original version, it was intended for parents.
yes,
Because
right.
I wanted to be able to, as I told you, I want to be able to hand something out to parents. And then when McGinnis and I were going to do it, again, read the preface, you'll get all the whole background. The other thing is, so that book was field tested from 2002 until 2016, the edition you have. And it existed as a Word file. And so every time a local district said, can you do a presentation? That was the training manual they'd walk away with. And so I'd always change it every time I went out and presented and answered questions that I got asked. And then as I was reading research during that 14-year period, I go, oh, that's good. That's going in there. So really, it went through 14 years of application and development before that 2016 one.
Wow. It's very useful. I mean, we do recommend it all the time just because it really does put into perspective what's actually going on in the brain when we read and when we identify when we're matching up those phonemes to graphemes. And I mean, it was an eye opener, absolutely. And we're actually we're going to start a second book study on it with our instructors because we use this information very, a lot, all the time in our courses. So, so we are running out of time, unfortunately.
I wish I came up with it, right? So I just
well, your name's on it.
kind of by incident, I got handed the baton by McGinnis.
You were you were in the right
all that
place.
research. Well, but I'll tell you though, and the same thing with like Aries orthographic mapping theory, whatever. I get hammered by people all the time as if I came up with these things or these are just my ideas.
Yeah.
It's like, folks, I'm not very creative at all. I'm more. My wife actually got me. I don't have it here. I have it at home when I do presentations. My wife got me a little UPS hat to put on and go. I'm just a UPS guy delivering stuff,
I
right?
love that.
You're very humble.
If you don't like what's in the package, don't blame the UPS guy. If you like what's in the package, you don't have to give him a hug, right? Okay, so
That's funny.
Well, regardless, we really appreciate all your work and all the insight. And this was very enlightening to me. I think
Me
this
too.
was
Yes,
wonderful.
it was amazing.
Yeah, and thank you so much for taking time out and talking. I'm sure you do millions of these all the time, but it's fresh news for our listeners, I'm sure. So thank you very much for doing this.
hey, well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Orton Gillingham Podcast, a BrainSpring production. For additional content, please subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at brainspring.com, or follow us on social media. To submit questions or comments, please email us at podcast@brainspring.com. Your feedback is always welcome.